I've been pigeonholing him to have a session like this for a couple of years. I couldn't make the last one in San Rafael. I had a baby and all sorts of fun things. So I'm delighted to be here with these three panelists. Just want to set the scene a little bit. We live in an age of unprecedented crisis. We are in a sort of a perfect storm of environmental, social, economic catastrophes, if you like, if you read the newspapers. And at the same time, we live in an age of unprecedented creativity, where any of us can get online and connect with someone else and create something without any of the means of production or the money we used to have. So we've got this amazing sort of inflection point in the world. And what I find extremely beautiful is we're heirs to an amazing inheritance, a birthright. We have this very strong and beautiful Western tradition which reached its zenith, I guess, in the Enlightenment, with a THE before it, of questioning authority and questioning the status quo, and it evolved into various different revolutions and rebellions and people saying no, this is not okay. You can see it right back with Moses, Spartacus, the Peasants' Revolt. You can see this tradition of an external questioning of what is. And then you have this other era that's come through us now through Kabbalah and Sufism and Gnosticism and other of the Western mystical traditions, but also now, of course, the Eastern traditions that we now have so much access to, in Taoism and Advaita and Zen, of questioning our own internal suffering and taking refuge, if you like, in a release of the illusions of our own experience. So we have these two beautiful bloodlines, if you like, that we have access to. And what, and a great question, what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do with them? So with that, now I'm going to open up to the panel. I thought what would be useful first would be to have a personal conversation first about our own personal experiences about sacred activism and rebellion, spiritual rebellion, the two versions, the two things shoved together were, and then maybe we can go a little bit grander into the philosophical and the scientific, so we can root it in our own practice of doing this. So we have Jack, Butler, Will Pye, and of course Elisabet Sahtouris talking. So do you want to take it in turns, Elisabet? Do you want to have a moment on your own personal experience of sacred activism?
It's on.
It's on. Okay. I don't know if my first activism was sacred. It wasn't. Certainly not consciously. Because it was back before we had an ecology movement or a women's movement or a personal spiritual development movement. And for me, it was activism, I mean political activism, in the most literal sense. Berkeley, 1962. I was there in Berkeley when that was the hot spot of political activism. And KPFK was the radio station that taught me something about world economics and stuff. I would buy the books that it recommended. But to make a long story short, probably the most sacred thing I did was in 1961, we did Women for Peace. We were supporting a statement Kennedy made in the UN about peace. Very simple. And we ended up getting called in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee. And we brought flowers to the senators and smiled sweetly. We're very ladylike, and they asked us to give us lists of all the members of our organization. And so we said, oh, we don't have lists, we don't keep lists, we don't. And, well, do you have communists in your ranks? And we said, oh, we hope so. We want everybody to be for peace. You know, I think that was pretty good spiritual work. You know, they didn't know what to do with us, so they, stopped investigating us. But it spread a movement at a time when there weren't even fax machines, much less email, and everything had to be done by telephone and on foot. And we literally took soapboxes and stood on street corners all across the United States, talking about peace. Later, I discovered the power of biology. It's politically unassailable. It doesn't matter what your politics are, you still have the same 100 trillion cell body that's highly cooperative and highly ethical, and you can use that for any political argument you want to make, pretty much, is to show how well done it is in your very cooperative body. So biology, since I believe that all biology is consciousness, that, you know, the first bacteria were intelligent as we are, if not more so. Bacteria are us. I was talking to Gino Yu about how I want to make games or movies or whatever for kids to explain that because the ancient bacteria learned cooperation and oneness, we are here today. That our cells are bacterial cooperatives, and we are big taxis for all those quadrillion bacteria running our immune systems. So I think it's spiritual activism to teach people what it is to play the whole keyboard from matter to spirit, what it is to ground cosmic love all the way down to our physical toes. That's what I think we're here to do. And that's enough for now.
How to follow that? I wasn't in Berkeley in 1961, that's for sure. I think for me, the movement towards a more sacred activism, if I look back at my teenage years, there was a great sense of anger, and a very righteous anger at what I saw in the world. What people said was valuable, parents, teachers, politicians, and so on, and what I saw. And of course, like many a teenager, I knew exactly how the world should be. It was, if only everyone listened to Will, then it would all be absolutely fine.
Yeah.
And I realized that this brought a lot of righteousness, a lot of anger, a lot of separation, a lot of judgment into the world. And that it dawned on me slowly. I think, Nick, you had that lovely Tolstoy quote that everyone wants to change the world and less think of changing themselves. And it dawned on me and became clear to me that first and foremost I had to create that which I wanted to see in the world in myself. Gandhi's, it's almost a cliche, be the change. And I think people don't actually get what he really means. It seems it's thrown around glibly. For me, if you want to see love and truth in the world, you're required to transform yourself into love and truth in each moment. And then perhaps think about sharing your vision of how the world could be. And to quote Gandhi again, give that message with love, or else the message and the messenger will be ignored. So that was a shift for me in my teenage years, was to recognize I had my inner world needed revolution, needed transformation, and that was where the work began. And so for me, the activism that is sacred is to engage fully, to embrace the paradox of the inherent perfection of everything at every point in time, and yet at the same time recognize there is so much imperfection within that perfection that one can be called to transform. But first, foremost, to bring a transformed being to that activism, to that work. Bring that love, bring that truth to your work of transformation.
Jack?
Well, I'll go for a quick bit of biography, and then I'm going to get right to my sort of focus of interest in this topic. So a quick bit of biography is, as a teenager, kind of falling in love with mind, body, spirit stuff, Waterstones, particularly American self-help, which seemed to be offering a kind of model of creating your own experience and empowering yourself, which, even though I had the kind of best of the British education system, scholarship place to private school, place at Cambridge, it didn't seem that education really talked to that part of being able to question your thoughts and manifest a vision for what you want in your life. So I founded a company when I was 21 that offers personal development training to young people, It's now got 12 full-time employees. It's one of the biggest providers of personal development training in the UK. I grew up in an atheist family, and it took me quite a long time to realise that I was quite a spiritual guy. I just didn't have the language for it, and most of the people that I connected with who had some kind of spiritual context seemed to come from a very dogmatic religious perspective, which I didn't find particularly appealing. So it took me quite a long time to just acknowledge that there's a very spiritual thing beyond religion that's permeated at particular levels of consciousness that gives it a certain expression. And my journey recently has been around discovering inner work over the last 5 years, meditation, yoga, and like you, Nick, spending a lot of time in the social enterprise and social purpose business community in London, the UK, where there's a lot of people who are out there doing a whole load of good things, finding a purpose, solving something in the world, change is possible, doing it for a more than profit motive. And I think the difficulty is balancing that external perspective with a real deep contact and knowing of self and awareness of your patterns, and as an entrepreneur, being able to marshal your frustration and urgency to go and change things in the world with really knowing what place that's coming from. So I'm really interested in what I now call conscious leadership, and how is it that you manifest a vision externally that's very congruent with a deep awareness of your own structures and patterns. And I think that's a sort of bridge between places like this, where I think the emphasis seems to be more on the internal, and the place that I've come from, which is a much more around what vision do you want to see in the world. And I'm curious how you square those two things.
So, thank you, everyone. So, one of the things that sort of the nub for me in my own work in both these areas, I also work in both these areas, which are the same area for me, but they don't seem to be for the world, so I have to separate them, is my own personal choices about things like flying. Do I fly to this conference, which is something that I want to minimise? Do I fly to go and do some training in Indonesia, teaching people how to be sacred activists? Or do I not? Do I eat meat or do I not? When I know that cows are one of the largest creators of methane and blah, 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 blah. These are some of the kind of really personal trade-offs we have to make in our own spiritual, activistic world. So what for you guys are the, where are those difficult points for you in terms of this balance between me in a practice, meditating? Because we could all meditate our way into a monastery and enjoy ourselves sitting on top of a mountain and loving it. And yet, there's a call. We feel the call. We can hear the suffering. Where do you personally, anyone have a personal, where do you get on that line? Where do you find things, this paradox / Cohen, where do you find those edges?
I think probably if I had to identify the one biggest lesson I had to learn in this life, it was to discern rather than judging. I managed to incarnate to an extremely judgmental mother who taught me exactly how to judge everything. And then I had to unlearn that, to discern rather than judging. Judging's hard. You're always in that seat where you have to make these judgments, And I adopted that metaphor of standing tall in your canoe, which I learned from Polynesian sailors, navigators, who had umpteen ways of navigating without compasses, and then said, if all else fails, stand tall in your canoe until you can see the land. And I use that model to say, take your consciousness up above you and see the human drama as on a stage. And discern the plot. You want to know what's going on. I was with a group of people with the Dalai Lama a few years back, and one of us asked the Dalai Lama, what's the most important meditation you can do now? And without batting an eye, he said, critical thinking followed by action. And he didn't mean criticize, judge.
Sure.
He meant discern what's going on in this human drama so that you can intelligently play the role of acting to do what you think needs doing, right? That you can choose. Now, if you watch the human drama on a stage, what do you say about the villain, the guy who's the biggest villain? Do you say, oh, I hate that guy, or he's a great actor? You know? You discern the plot, and you say, wow, He's playing the villain so that we understand what we don't want to be and do. And it's here, he's doing that to wake me up. So I have to bow to him for doing, who's doing the best wake-up call job on the planet? Maybe right now it's the bankers who are playing this huge gambling game in this huge global casino, most of it, 97% of which has nothing to do with the real economy. And we're sitting watching that play. Are we learning anything from it? Are we going to point our fingers and say, oh, those evil guys? Or are we going to say, oh, we're supposed to create a different kind of money on the planet? We're supposed to do something different. And maybe democracy hasn't worked very well yet because we hadn't developed spiritually. We hadn't developed our inner selves enough to know that we're all reflections of each other, that all of you, create me and I create you and all that stuff that a lot of ancient cultures had already learned. So we gave up our power to, you cast your ballot and then they do democracy. It doesn't work that way, we now see, right? We have to do it. They're not going to take care of us. How do we take care of each other is the question.
Absolutely.
So it's that get out of judgment, into discernment, into understanding our oneness, and then act on behalf of each other to make a better world.
There's actually...
It's not that hard, is it? We're only 7 billion people. And my body is 100 trillion cells, each of which are as complex as a large human city, working in concert, ethically, full employment, no exploitation among the organs. Why is it so hard?
It's a beautiful, beautiful vision. There's actually a little bit of research. There's some research that shows that democracies are actually tend to be the places where genocides occur more than in hierarchical countries, which is quite an interesting bit of historical looking. Will, Jack, want to contribute onto that?
Well, I'm going to disagree. Is that right? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. That sounds easy and simple, and at some level, yes, things are simple. But I also think in the realm of politics, things are complex. And I actually think that sometimes, we look at the political system and we say that's, we can criticise it, but actually creating a better one it's difficult. It's incremental. It's gradual. I guess I'm a believer in kind of evolutionary change versus revolutionary change. And I've come back. I spent 6 months in America, and a lot of people feel that Obama's kind of let them down because he was the big, yes we can guy, and this massive tide of hope as politicians get on their way in. And people say, yeah, but what he didn't get is that he's gone into a system and he's now being controlled by whatever interests or corporations or a stymied Congress. David Cameron got into office, said I pulled the chain and nothing happened. But these guys every day they're walking a line which is incredibly hard. Presence is much easier in stillness and contemplation than it is if you're busting your gut on a 16-hour day with a mine of information crossing your desk and you've got to stay clear as to what the priorities are. So I think some of the criticisms of the Occupy movement, which is like, great, you're pointing out the problem, how do we build a better society? I think coming up with those incremental solutions is actually challenging, and I think it does take all of us, and we often want to think as a whole system, and as actually our fractal part of the system that we can influence and make change with. But I think being spiritual in the political space is actually challenging.
And there's a similarity with what you both say, which is discerning what's occurring in the system, as opposed to what's occurring in my own little world. And one of the things and there's a lot of work in this area teaching kids systems thinking, so they learn from a very early age that we don't work in a mechanistic universe, we work in a systemic organism, which is interesting. Do you have anything to that?
Realising that interconnectedness, both in a physical, sociological sense, but also in a more subtle, energetic sense, seems to be really important to keep in mind. When you spoke of the discernment rather than the judgment and how we regard the Dick Cheneys and the Saddam Husseins of this world, to joking aside, to offer them the same love and compassion, recognise their Buddha nature as we would anyone else. Gina Reinhardt right now is on her way to becoming the richest woman in the world. She's worth $25 billion, having inherited her father's iron ore business in Australia. On the way, apparently, within 10 years to $100 billion. When you've got 25, getting 100 billion just happens like that. And what's she doing with her power and her wealth? She's setting up organisations that obfuscate the process of creating any legislation to tackle pollution and so on. And she's also in the process of destroying significant parts of the Great Barrier Reef to facilitate a greater profitability of her business, because why would you put the boat all the way around to Western Australia where it can go? Yeah, it's quite an extraordinary response to our times. And yet, in myself, can I see that greed? Can I see that selfishness? Can I see that impulse to act without much intelligence and to look after myself? I absolutely can. So to regard the whole drama with that love, with that acceptance, with that discernment, and to not make the villains the evil ones, but to recognize they are themselves dancers of oneness as we are. And to bring it back from Jack's intelligent comments on the structures, my focus might be to make that point, to find that greed, to find that anger, to find that ignorance in ourselves, and to transform it in ourselves as part of our sacred activism.
I mean, it's a very, yeah.
First of all, I think you need to meet her. She needs to meet you.
I would be
Can you
delighted.
do arrange that?
My contacts in the Australian iron ore industry, not so hard.
I think we need to work this out so that Julia can meet him, because it'll be a transformative experience for her. I think she'd like to meet you.
I'm sure she can afford it.
Just in case, there may be someone in the room. You know the thing about there's only 3 links to be connected to anyone in the world? Somebody figure this one out, how Julia gets to meet Will. As for you, I'd like to say, in my evolution theory, things don't go by small increments any more than sea level rise will. Okay? It goes in fits and starts. And it's when the biggest crises have happened in evolution that the most rapid changes have happened. So I don't think it will take a long time. Look, if the young generations today, who don't seem to be terribly interested in war and greed and stuff like that, play that out, refuse to go to war, and do things their way, they don't do racism either. Many of them are mixed up and, by now have 20 different cultural parentages and things like that. I believe in one generation, the whole world could be different. So evolution is not slower than revolution. And in fact, I like to put in front of the word evolution an R in parentheses standing for rapid evolution. Revolution, rapid evolution. That's what we're up for now. We're right at that place where we are moving into biological maturity, out of the youthful phase of expansion and competition and creativity in that process. And this has been learned over and over and over in evolution over time. And globalization is this process. You can see it as metamorphosis, where the caterpillar is eating 300 times its weight every day. And it's a good representative of our exploitative economy. And then it's so bloated it hangs itself up and goes to sleep. And in its sleep, these little biologists actually call them imaginal cells, because that forming butterfly is called the imago. But imaginal cells for us is also about imagination, right? And these are like stem cells that have been kept inside the folds of the skin of the caterpillar, dormant. And suddenly these stem cells start to emerge and start to connect with each other, and then the caterpillar melts down into a nutritive soup for the butterfly to complete its process and live more lightly on the earth. So it's a nice metaphor. I got it originally from Nori Huddle, who wrote a book called Butterfly, illustrated like a children's book, using this metaphor. And I've used it ever since. It's on my website, which is sahtouris.com. And this is the metaphor I live by, that we are in a phase where the youthful caterpillar types are heading the corporations and the banks. And they only know how to be caterpillars, how to feed off everyone else and how to make these, this gambling casino and stuff. And It isn't that they're bad guys, it's just that no one's taught them any game other than Monopoly to play. So they don't know what else to do, and give me one more fix, before the game is over. But at the same time, as Paul Hawken has pointed out, we have more than 1 million NGOs building various ways of healing the earth and feeding people and cleaning rivers and doing all those things, in addition to having international space stations and the ability to change money across all cultures, and the United Nations and NATO, and all of these things are examples of humans coming into the cooperative mode. So we are already well on our way, and the internet, of course, is the largest self-creating living system on the planet. It's not made of technology, it's made of people who use technology to connect with each other. And so with the access to the internet, this new generation can actually transform the entire world in one generation. So in that sense, I think we have the capacity right now, exactly when we need it, to make enormous changes. And I'm hoping that communicating with emoticons on their iPhones, they resonate to each other emotionally. The first language in human history that has an alphabet for feelings. And we think, oh gosh, there goes the neighborhood of language because they've stripped down the verbal stuff to impossible shorthand. But that balances out with the emotional language coming in more strongly. And if they resonate to each other across any distance and feel the same emotion, I think the direct mental transmission will extend to exchanging all kinds of information, and that will make a difference. So what difference does it make? They're becoming transparent to each other. And transparency is what's happening in the world now. First it was Enron exposed, in the corporate exposure, and then the church got exposed. And now we've got WikiLeaks exposing governments. And so as we humans individually are becoming transparent to each other, so are our institutions becoming transparent. So these are all enormously important events that are happening in our world to assist us in carrying out our spiritual oneness with each other.
It's the duck leaf and the nettle.
Oh yeah.
Have both, and you get to choose.
So hopeful.
I'm also hopeful, although I think there are challenges. Now, would anyone like to challenge us? I think we've got some furious agreement. This gentleman here, do you want to? Thank you.
I just, when you are speaking, I just thought that you started with you are think that the world is not like what you want, and if most of the people are thinking like that, so it's not a democracy. So democracy is if the world should be like most of the people. So I think maybe it's an idea to, and I know that people are talking about it, a direct democracy. That, we have the technology to create a democracy directly.
Real democracy.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And I think it's
not representative democracy, which is representative of vested interests, essentially.
So what do you think about it?
So what does democracy look like in a world where we have this capacity to communicate and connect? Where we have actually more of I'm a big fan of the spiritual anarchist movement, the Christian anarchists, and some of the work they were doing many, many years ago, in actually looking at how do you bring about real communities, not virtual, where you can actually live in accordance with your spiritual truth and in accordance with a sense of political equality. So what's your thoughts on democracy today?
Whatever it's for me, listening to the gentleman.
Direct democracy, that there is a technology to
absolutely direct.
Absolutely, everybody can.
Absolutely, the internet offers extraordinary capacity for that direct democracy, and there's an organisation in Australia called Get Up, which has, I think, about 500,000 members in a country of 20 million, and it's well known now that the politicians listen to what this group say and what they give their names to, and there's the international movement of VAZ, ABAAZ, which I saw their celebration of their accomplishments, and it's an extraordinary thing to see just just a few million people saying, we believe this. So holding to those ideals, and it's something that's important in our own personal expression and community expression. For me, to reclaim idealism. Idealism is used as a word to, in a pejorative sense, to you're not living in the real world. And I think holding on to those ideals and recognizing the extraordinary degree to which those ideals are shared, forgetting what the mainstream media might suggest, and that social blessed unrest you mentioned, Paul Hawking, what a wonderful book to read and recognize that right now there are 1 million NGOs, or more, perhaps 2 million by another estimate, that are actually right now working in a direct democratic fashion to create change on a community level. So there is good reason to have huge hope from that.
Jackie, yeah, so you have something to say?
Yeah, I'm involved in an organisation called the Simultaneous Policy Organisation. I guess just briefly, the idea is that we're moving from an ethnocentric consciousness through a nation-centric consciousness to a kind of global civic consciousness, and that many of the pressing issues of the day are global issues, and hence we need some kind of global governance, not necessarily government, but global governance structure in order to deal with that. So the idea of simultaneous policy is to say, well, we all know that climate change is an issue. It's an international climate of destructive competition. No nation wants to move first because they have first mover disadvantage, so we need to press the button simultaneously. The tricky bit is how you get, which measures go forward and how you get agreement at a nation level, given that you have got some democratic regimes, but I think it can also work with non-democratic regimes. But it's the actual process of, yes, direct democracy through to some kind of global governance that works. I think that's a really interesting question, what the structures are that mediate that.
One of the things that is very interesting in this space, the 2 million social enterprises and NGOs who are out there, one of the challenges, I work in this space, so one of the challenges you see is that other people doing very beautiful things at a very micro level for their village, their town, their region. Often not knowing that in the same village, literally, in the same slum, are other people who are kind of doing a similar thing, but slightly different, and etc., but multiplied over multiplied over multiplied. So one of the things that I'm personally involved in is how do you use some of this systemic thinking that occurs usually at a state level or some kind of policy level to enable some of these micro activities to join up and to pool resources, pool activities. And if you're interested in this space, there's a site called reamp.org, reamp.org. It's in the Midwest of the US, 7 states. Started off with about 20 NGOs, there's now about 120. And their mission is 80% reduction in carbon in X number of years, and crazy figure for America that is on the tit of Saudi Arabia, for want of a better expression. What they've done is they've managed to get 4 governors, I think the last look I looked at the site, signed up to their protocol. They've had $100 million in investment for clean energy. They've stopped numerous dirty coal stations being built. But the interesting thing about it is the way the guy who set it up got there is the fact he persuaded a very, very pioneering foundation to give them $1 million, not to do anything yet, just to sit down every few weeks, draw systems maps, understand who's doing what and where we are, develop some collaborative IQ, some interlocking, and then go out and orchestrate these micro events into something far more systemic, far more disruptive. And I think that's where the technology can really help us, is in joining us, all our little things we do, into something that has a bit more of this kind of radical, disruptive impact in the world. Gerda.
2 questions maybe. As I see it, it's our monetary system that has us caught in some prison. Is that the thing that keeps us from doing the right thing, or is it some other kind of prison that we're in? And the second question, how would the new narrative be created? By whom, what process, what should it look like?
So let's have the first question about debt, essentially, and the monetary. I think, Elisabet, you have some insights in this area.
Just before I do it, I wanted to ask, how many of you do know Avaaz, which Will mentioned? A-V-A-A-Z or Z.
Quite a few.
The rest of you, do look it up. One of the original founders of it is in my village of 850 people on Mallorca, Alice J. And I think it's phenomenal. It's up to about 15 million members now. And at the tiniest click of a button, you get to vote on all these things, and you get to see who else is voting right now with you and what countries they're voting in, boo-boo. And they assayed their membership to find out what the membership wants, what issues they should be dealing with. So that the membership gets to decide which the issues are, and then they frame them, and then you vote on them. And it's a stupendous website. It's really, really wonderful. Do look it up. And yes?
I think it's called crowdsourcing.
That's
Well,
the kind of form, yeah.
Yes, the general idea is
The
crowdsourcing,
term
yeah, which you can do for money or votes or anything else, yes. As to the monetary system, there are 2 books I'd like to recommend to you. One just came out called Money and Sustainability. And yes, I think the banking system is what's causing the most trouble right now, because it's telling us all that we're in a recession and thereby creating our reality of unemployment and throwing people out of houses and all this awful stuff. And we've got to reinvent local currencies. We should be in Europe reinventing national currencies and keeping the euro for international trade. We could do this, but we must issue these monies as non-debt monies, and so that they don't go replay the same monopoly game. Debt money was invented to concentrate wealth. That's why I call it a monopoly game. When the game is over, one kid has all the money, right? And then you either redistribute it or you play something else. And I think we should be playing something else now. So that is the best book on why we need an ecology of currencies rather than just one. And you know, America got out of its depression by thousands of local currencies. People simply printed them, gave them away to each other, and then traded them to make the economy go. You buy services and goods from each other with it. We did this in Santa Barbara. We called them Santa Barbara Hours. We printed them on hemp paper. We said in community we trust. And we gave them away and people traded them, right? So you can do this. Money, if you believe it has value, it works. So you have to get agreement on the part of the people you give the money to use it as value. Or you can do, if you do it online, you do zero accounting. You want to keep your balance at zero, meaning balancing what you give to the community and what you get from the community. And so all kinds of people discover that babysitting and baking bread and stuff contributes to the economy and can get in there and trade along with those who repair computers and paint houses and stuff, so or grow food. So we can do this thing. We can invent our own money, and we can change that. So the Money and Sustainability book. The other book I recommend strongly is Ross Jackson, Occupy World Street. Does anyone know about that book? Occupy World Street by Ross Jackson. The first part of the book is the best description I know of the Reagan-Thatcher economics that have been privatizing the world ever since the 70s, right? And of course the 70s came about as a reaction to our 60s. We were threatening real democracy to people who didn't want it. The kind of capitalism we practice in the world today is inimical to democracy. They're oil and water. They don't mix very well, right? One is about concentrating wealth and one is about distributing fairly where people see to the well-being of a community. We need to get rid of the GDP measure. It's crazy. And the people who invented it exempt themselves from it. So the global casino, which is 95%, 97% of financial transactions, don't get counted in anybody's GDP, but they make you count in the local economies. And coining your own money can be done in such ways that it raises your GDP if you want to keep the stupid measure. It doesn't measure
GDP
well-being.
was created for war. It was created on a desire to solve a war issue. And yet we kept it after the war, and it carried on being very specific.
So anyway, the second part of Occupy World Street is important because Jackson became a currency trader in the 80s in order to make a lot of money to fund his Gaia Trust. and fund eco-villages all over the world, which he did. And then to connect them, GEN.org, I think, is Global Eco-Village Network. So he then, understanding how you found eco-villages from the grassroots, applies that to the global level and says, how could we change things at a global level? And what he proposes is get 6 to 8 to 10 small countries that don't have a big stake in the world economy to secede from the World Trade Organization and form their own Gaian League to trade with each other based on human rights and sustainable economies. Okay, and then make that an attractor that brings more and more people in, and gradually, you know, you expand the bubble.
You already have.
Pardon?
You already have ALBA in the Latin America, which is about 10 states.
Bolivia and
Yes.
Venezuela are high up on
Yes.
that list, I imagine.
And Iceland, of course, is the first country to have broken out of the World Trade Organization in this whole privatization scheme. Maybe Greece will be the next one, who knows? But anyway, those are two important texts for our times.
Super. Do I have one last question? Because I know you had your hand up a while back. And then we'll wrap up for lunch, I believe.
So I have a question for all four of you.
We don't have time for that.
One question. And that is, you all seem to stand for something. To have an ideal, you seem to stand for something. So I'm interested to learn what may motivate you.
So can we have that answer? Let's start with Jack in 10 words or less.
I think a lot of my motivation comes from my social instinct. So I think when I was talking about the balance between the kind of inner and the outer, I think it's quite natural for me to see that there are things that I want to be a part of helping solve. And I think a lot of religion is about the balancing of the social instinct and the self-preservation instinct, and how you get that balance working. So, people, I guess.
People. One word.
It's less than 10.
Love, truth, and joy turn me on. Absence does not.
I believe that we are spirit having a human experience, and that we're here in this physical world as human beings to ground cosmic love down to our physical toes. That's all.
I would say mine would be absolute insight into our radical interconnectedness, and from a sheer emanation of love, wanting to make sure everyone's pain is minimal. Thank you so much for everyone on the panel. I'm going to ask you radically, I'm going to invite you to really delve into your practice of non-duality or science, whatever side or both sides, and invite you to really look at the crises that we encounter and what your personal response is, or could be, or will be. That's my invitation to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I invite you to start a conference on this topic.
One second.
Yeah, everybody, please, Jara is going to play the song and sing.